Hi everyone, my name is Lisa, and today I want to tell you a story that is both heartbreaking and unforgettable. It is a story about a woman whose entire existence was defined by sacrifice. A mother who carried pain in her bones, silence in her heart, and hope in her eyes. She endured hunger so her child could eat, exhaustion so her child could sleep, humiliation so her child could stand tall. And yet, when her story reached its conclusion, the very daughter she raised with such devotion rewarded her not with gratitude, but with words that cut deeper than any wound: insults. This is not a fairy tale, and it is not a work of fiction. It is the reality of countless women across generations. Mothers who gave up their youth, their dreams, their freedom, and even their health, so their children could have a chance at something better. This particular story, however, belongs to one woman, a woman whose name deserves to be remembered, even if history itself forgot her. As we journey together through her life, I want you to picture every scene not as something distant, but as if it were unfolding before your eyes. The dimly lit room where she labored late at night, the cold streets she walked to provide food, the quiet tears she shed when no one was watching. This story is about sacrifice and betrayal, love and cruelty, and the silent strength that only a mother can carry. So, come with me. Let us walk into her world, step into her pain, and see how the very heart that beat only for her daughter was repaid with words that shattered it. The story begins in a small village where the earth itself seemed tired, where fields cracked under the weight of drought, and the houses leaned with age. This is where she was born, a girl destined not for fairy tales but for survival. Her childhood was not marked by play or laughter, but by chores too heavy for small hands and silence too sharp for young ears. She learned early what it meant to carry water from the well until her arms trembled, what it meant to cook for her brothers while her own stomach remained empty, what it meant to listen to her father's harsh words and her mother's resigned silence. From the very beginning, life pressed her into a mold of endurance. Yet within her, there was always a spark, the quiet belief that one day, perhaps through her, someone else could live differently. When she became a mother, that spark became a fire. She was young, too young perhaps, when her daughter was placed into her arms, fragile and crying, demanding more of her than she thought she had left to give. But she looked at that tiny face and saw not burden, but possibility. From that day forward, everything she endured willingly, because she believed it would carve out a better future for the child she cradled. Nights blurred into mornings with her rocking the baby on her shoulder, whispering songs even when her own body screamed for rest. Days stretched long as she worked in homes not her own, cleaning floors and washing clothes for pennies, just so she could return home with food. She ate little, always leaving the better portion for her daughter, telling herself hunger was easier to bear when it meant the child could grow strong. The seasons turned, and the girl grew. With each year, the mother's sacrifices deepened. School fees had to be paid, uniforms bought, books purchased. There were times she sold the few possessions she had. Her jewelry, a gifted shawl from her wedding. Also, her daughter could walk into the classroom with dignity. And when the money still wasn't enough, she worked longer hours, scrubbing, stitching, carrying heavy loads until her back ached. Her hands grew rough, cracked and blistered, yet she hid them in her lap whenever she touched her daughter's face, afraid that the roughness might somehow leave a mark. She never spoke of her suffering. To her it was not sacrifice, but duty. though inside she hoped her daughter would one day recognize the price being paid. She endured insults from employers who saw her as little more than a shadow. She endured whispers from neighbors who mocked her for struggling alone. She endured nights of loneliness when she longed for companionship, but reminded herself that her life belonged not to her, but to the child. She carried all this pain silently, wrapping it like a cloak around her shoulders, convincing herself it was worth it if it meant her daughter could step into a brighter world. The daughter, meanwhile, lived with an innocence only a mother's protection can provide. She never knew the hunger her mother tasted, never felt the shame of patched clothing because her mother mended in the dark of night. She never realized that her own laughter often came at the expense of her mother's tears. As she grew into a young woman, she became more aware of the world and less aware of the sacrifices that had built it. Where once she clung to her mother's hand, now she pulled away, embarrassed by the woman who carried the smell of soap and sweat from endless labor. She began to see the rough hands, the tired eyes, the old clothes, and instead of gratitude, she felt shame. The mother noticed the distance but said nothing. She told herself it was part of growing up, part of seeking independence. She remembered the nights she had whispered prayers over the child's sleeping form, begging that she would one day stand taller than her mother ever could. And so, when the girl grew restless and critical, the mother held her tongue, swallowing her hurt like bitter medicine. She continued to labor, to bend, to sacrifice, telling herself love was patient, that one day her daughter would understand. But the insults began slowly, creeping into daily life like shadows at dusk. At first, they were small, careless words thrown in anger. The daughter snapped at her mother for being too slow, for not understanding the new world she was living in. She mocked her for her lack of education, for her accent, for the simplicity of her ways. The mother pretended not to hear, smiling weakly, convincing herself the girl didn't mean it. Yet each word left a wound, unseen but bleeding inside. As years passed, the insults sharpened. The daughter, now a young woman, compared her mother to others. Mothers who were educated, who spoke elegantly, who wore fine clothes. She forgot that her own education had been paid for by the blistered hands she now scorned. She forgot that the clothes she admired on others were purchased with money her mother would never spend on herself. She forgot that every privilege she enjoyed was built upon the foundation of her mother's suffering. Instead, she saw only lack, only imperfection, only shame. The mother aged quickly. Her back bent further each year. Her hair grayed before its time. Yet she never stopped working, never stopped providing, never stopped loving the daughter who had become her reason for living. At night, when the house was quiet, she would sometimes sit by the window, staring out into the darkness, wondering if love was meant to hurt this much. But she never allowed herself to regret. To her, motherhood was not a choice that could be undone. It was a covenant, one she had sworn the day she first held her daughter. And then came the day when the insults turned public. Surrounded by others, the daughter spoke with disdain, ridiculing her mother's clothes, her lack of refinement, her ignorance of the modern world. Laughter filled the room, but it pierced the mother's heart. She lowered her eyes, unable to defend herself because love had taken away her voice. She smiled faintly, hiding her pain, and later, when alone, she wept. These were not the tears of exhaustion she had shed in silence before. These were tears of betrayal, of realizing that the very person for whom she had carried every burden now saw her not as a hero, but as a failure still. She endured. She continued to serve, to give, to love. Even as her daughter's words cut deeper, she told herself that love was stronger than pride, that perhaps one day gratitude would blossom. She imagined a future where her daughter, older and wiser, would sit beside her and finally say thank you. That hope kept her moving, even when her body begged for rest. The truth, however, was harsher. Gratitude never came. Insults grew more frequent, more venomous, as the daughter distanced herself further. The mother became a relic in her own home, present yet unseen, spoken to only when scolded, remembered only when criticized. And yet, despite everything, her heart never hardened. She never allowed bitterness to replace love. To the very end, she believed her sacrifices were not wasted, because they had given her daughter a chance at life, even if that life turned away from her. Her story, though painful, is not unique. Across the world, countless mothers have carried similar burdens, have given everything only to receive nothing in return. They are the silent architects of futures they will never inhabit, the invisible hands that shape destinies, the unsung heroes whose names history rarely remembers. And while the world forgets, their love lingers in the lives they built, even if those lives deny them. This is her legacy: endurance in the face of pain, love in the face of insult, sacrifice in the face of betrayal. Her story reminds us of a truth too often overlooked, that the greatest acts of love are not always rewarded, and that sometimes the deepest wounds are inflicted not by enemies but by those we love most. The years moved forward with a steady cruelty, each season leaving its mark upon the woman's body. Her once lively step grew slower. Her hands that once could lift baskets of laundry with ease now trembled under the weight of even a simple pot. Yet still she pressed on. To her, weariness was not an excuse. As long as her daughter needed her, as long as the household demanded her hands, she would not stop. She convinced herself that fatigue was a privilege she could never afford, that rest was a luxury meant for others. Her body, after all, was the currency she had always spent in silence. But silence is heavy, and over time, silence becomes a prison. The words she never said, the wounds she never revealed, they all gathered inside her like stones filling a jar. Some nights she would lie awake and remember her youth, the days when she once had dreams of her own. She had wanted to study, to learn how to read the letters that danced across pages she could only half understand. She had wanted to travel beyond the boundaries of her village, to see the city lights she had heard about from passing traders. She had even once imagined herself standing proudly with her head held high, not bent under the shame of poverty. But those dreams had been buried long ago, sacrificed at the altar of motherhood. She never blamed her daughter for that. In fact, she wore those sacrifices like badges of honor, reminding herself that through her daughter, those dreams might live again. What she did not expect was that her daughter would not see them as sacrifices, but as failings. To the girl, her mother's lack of education became a source of embarrassment, her rough appearance an object of ridicule, her humble ways a reason to distance herself. In gatherings, the daughter often minimized her mother's presence, lowering her voice when introducing her, sometimes not introducing her at all. The mother felt the sting of invisibility, the peculiar pain of being erased from the very life she had built. Yet even then she whispered no complaint. She believed that motherhood required humility, that perhaps enduring humiliation was just another part of love. Life outside their home offered little refuge. Society has always been quick to measure women by what they possess, rather than what they endure. Neighbors judged her by the patched garments she wore, by the simplicity of her meals, by the absence of a husband's presence in her life. Rumors circled, whispered behind cupped hands, that she must have been abandoned because she was not good enough, that her daughter would surely rise above her because she could never amount to much. She carried those whispers the way she carried every burden, silently, inwardly, without allowing them to crack the facade of calm she wore in front of her daughter. For if she broke, who would her child lean upon? There were moments, however, when her endurance faltered. Late in the night, after another day of insults, she would allow herself to cry quietly into the folds of her pillow. She tried to smother the sound, afraid that even her tears might disturb her daughter's rest. In those moments, she asked herself questions she never dared voice aloud. Had she failed? Had all her sacrifices been invisible? Was love itself not enough to bridge the gap between what she gave and what she received? But by morning she would wipe her face, braid her hair neatly, and rise again with the same determination. For a mother's despair, she believed, should never become her child's burden. The daughter, now a young adult, became increasingly absorbed in her own world. Education had opened doors for her, and she walked through them without looking back. She had new friends, new ambitions, new horizons that stretched far beyond the village lanes and narrow streets her mother still walked. When she spoke of her life, it was always in comparison. What others had, what others did, what her mother could never provide. She wanted sophistication, elegance, recognition. To her, her mother symbolized everything she wanted to escape. Poverty, struggle, ignorance. And so the distance between them grew, not just in geography, but in heart. One particular day remained carved in the mother's memory, though she never spoke of it again. The daughter, dressed in clothes finer than anything the mother had ever owned, returned home from an outing with her friends. They had laughed together, their voices echoing through the small house, until one of them made a passing remark about the mother's appearance. Instead of defending her, the daughter joined in, mocking her own mother's worn dress and weathered face. The room filled with laughter, but to the mother it felt like knives piercing her chest. She lowered her gaze, cheeks burning with humiliation, but said nothing. Later that night, when the house grew quiet, she sat alone, staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror. She touched the lines on her face, the gray in her hair, and for the first time she wondered if her daughter's insults were right. Perhaps she truly had become a burden. Perhaps her worth had diminished into nothing more than a source of shame. Yet even in that moment of despair, she prayed for her daughter's happiness, asking God to give the girl everything she herself had been denied. Time, however, has a way of stripping illusions. The daughter's rise in the world did not come without cost. The friendships she valued so deeply proved fickle. The opportunities she chased often ended in disappointment, and the recognition she craved remained elusive. Yet instead of turning back to the mother who had always been her anchor, she lashed out even more, projecting her frustrations onto the one person who would never abandon her. Insults became a daily ritual, her words sharpened not by truth, but by bitterness. She accused her mother of holding her back, of being the reason she could not shine as brightly as she wished. The mother listened quietly, nodding as if the words were true, because to her, absorbing pain was easier than fighting it. Behind this cycle of sacrifice and insult lies a universal pattern repeated through generations. History is filled with stories of mothers who labored unseen, whose love was misunderstood, whose lives were spent creating futures for others. while their own names faded into obscurity. In every culture, in every time, women have bent their backs so their children could walk upright, only to find themselves diminished in their children's eyes. It is a tragedy both intimate and widespread, a wound carried not just by individuals, but by societies that fail to honor the silent strength of mothers. The woman's health began to falter as the years went on. Long hours of labor had worn her body thin, and age crept in with its merciless weight. Her joints ached, her breathing grew shallow, and yet she kept working, afraid that stopping would make her useless. Illness came in whispers at first. A persistent cough, a heaviness in her chest, a fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. She ignored it, convincing herself that she could not afford weakness, not when her daughter still needed her. But the body does not forgive neglect, and soon her condition worsened. Even then, her greatest worry was not for herself, but for who would care for her daughter if she could no longer rise from bed. The daughter, consumed by her own struggles, saw her mother's frailty not with compassion but with impatience. She grew frustrated at the slowing pace, the trembling hands, the repeated coughs. Instead of gratitude, she offered more criticism, accusing her mother of becoming a burden, of failing to keep up with the demands of modern life. The mother listened, heart heavy but silent, choosing once again to bear the insult rather than defend herself. She believed that love was measured not in words but in endurance, and she endured until her body could endure no more. Even as her health failed, her thoughts never left her daughter. She worried about her future, about who would stand beside her when life grew difficult, about whether she would ever realize the depth of her mother's love. In her final days, when strength slipped away like sand through her fingers, she whispered prayers not for her own healing, but for her daughter's happiness. Her last acts were still of service, preparing small meals when she could, folding clothes despite the pain in her back, offering comfort even as her own body begged for rest. She passed from this world as she had lived in it, quietly, humbly, with love written into every action. The daughter, confronted at last with the absence of the woman she had insulted for so long, was forced to reckon with the truth. Only then did the silence of the house strike her with its weight. Only then did she realize that the meals no longer appeared magically on the table, that the clothes no longer folded themselves, that the quiet presence she had dismissed had in fact been the foundation of her life. Grief has a way of stripping away pride, of exposing what words once concealed. And in her grief, the daughter finally saw her mother for what she truly was. Not a source of shame, but the greatest source of strength she had ever known. The days following her passing unfolded in a haze of quiet sorrow. The house that had always been filled with the soft rhythm of her labor now echoed with emptiness. The daughter, once quick to raise her voice, now found herself unable to fill the silence. She would walk through the small rooms, noticing the details she had overlooked all her life. The patched curtains her mother had sewn with tired fingers, the chipped cups carefully arranged so they still seemed whole, the faint scent of soap and wood smoke that lingered on the walls. Each object became a reminder of the sacrifices she had mocked. Each corner whispered stories of love disguised as labor. Where once she had seen poverty and shame, now she saw devotion and endurance. But realization, cruel as it is, often comes too late. In those first weeks, she began to piece together the life she had dismissed. Neighbors who had once whispered gossip now came forward with stories of her mother's kindness. How she had shared food even when she had little. How she had mended clothes for children who were not her own. How she had defended others in quiet, unseen ways. The daughter listened, stunned, as if hearing of a stranger. And yet each tale painted the portrait of the woman she had called her mother. She began to understand that her mother's strength had not been loud or celebrated. It had been woven into every unacknowledged act of service, every silent endurance, and it was precisely this invisibility that had allowed her to mistake love for weakness. Guilt settled upon her like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. She replayed the insults in her mind, each word now sounding crueler than it had when first spoken. She remembered the public ridicule, the careless mockery, the sharp impatience she had directed at the one person who had never turned her away. She remembered the moments when her mother had smiled faintly, hiding her pain, and she realized now that those smiles had been shields, protecting the daughter from her own cruelty. The weight of regret grew unbearable, and yet there was no one left to whom she could apologize. The finality of death is merciless. It allows no second chances, no mending of wounds, no spoken forgiveness. In the quiet of the nights, she often sat by the window where her mother used to sit. She would trace the outlines of the stars, remembering how her mother's eyes had once gazed at the same sky with unspoken prayers. She tried to imagine what those prayers had been, and though she could never know, she felt certain they had been for her. The thought both comforted and haunted her. To be the recipient of so much love, and to repay it with cruelty. It was a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. Time moved forward, as it always does, though for the daughter it felt as if she were walking through water, each step heavy with remorse. She tried to rebuild her life, to chase the ambitions she had once pursued with such determination. But success felt hollow, and recognition rang empty. In every accomplishment, she felt the absence of the one person she wished she could share it with. In every joy, she felt the sting of knowing her mother would never see it. Gratitude had finally bloomed in her heart, but it had come too late, like flowers blooming after the season had ended. Her grief led her to reflect not only on her own story, but on the broader pattern of motherhood itself. She began to notice other women, bent with labor, their sacrifices hidden behind ordinary routines. She saw mothers carrying heavy baskets in the market, while their children walked freely beside them. Mothers skipping meals so their children could eat. Mothers whose names were never spoken in celebration, but whose work sustained entire families. She realized her own mother's story was not isolated, but universal. Part of a lineage of women whose love was both the strongest force in the world and the most taken for granted. This realization, though painful, became a turning point. She could not undo her past, but perhaps she could honor it by refusing to repeat its mistakes. Slowly, she began to speak differently. When others dismissed their mothers as outdated or embarrassing, she shared her own story, her own regret. She spoke of sacrifice, of unseen labor, of love expressed not in words but in deeds. At first, her voice trembled, for guilt made her feel unworthy of speaking about her mother's greatness. But with time, she found strength in telling the truth. Her mother had lived quietly, but through her daughter's voice, her story began to echo. People listened, some with tears, some with shame, some with recognition, as they thought of the mothers in their own lives. And in that way, the mother who had been invisible in life began to be seen in death. Yet for all the daughter's attempts to make amends through words, she could never escape the memory of her own cruelty. Forgiveness from others did not soothe her, because the forgiveness she longed for could only come from the one who was gone. She visited her mother's grave often, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes simply sitting in silence. She would whisper apologies into the wind, though she knew no answer would come. And still, in her heart, she felt that her mother would not have wanted apologies. She would have wanted her daughter to live well, to be happy. That knowledge was both comforting and unbearable, because it reminded her once again of the depth of love she had squandered. As the years passed, the daughter aged, and with age came a different kind of wisdom. She began to resemble her mother in small ways. The lines forming on her face, the gray in her hair, the weariness in her bones after long days. And with each resemblance, she felt both closer to and more haunted by her mother. She understood now, in ways she never could before, what it meant to sacrifice silently, what it meant to love without reward, what it meant to endure without complaint. She had become the very woman she once mocked, and in that transformation, she found a strange kind of redemption. In the end, her life became a testimony to the lessons her mother had taught, though not in the way either of them had expected. Her story was no longer just her own, but part of a larger truth. That love is often misunderstood, that sacrifice is often invisible, and that gratitude, if left unspoken, can turn into a lifetime of regret. She carried her mother's legacy forward, not through grand monuments or public recognition, but through the quiet insistence that no mother's love should go unseen. No mother's sacrifice should go unacknowledged. And so the story comes full circle. A tale of pain and endurance, of insults and devotion, of regret and remembrance. A mother endured all the pain for her daughter, and in return she got insults. Yet even in the face of betrayal, her love never wavered. And in the silence of her absence, that love spoke louder than any insult ever could. It remains a reminder to all who hear it, to see the sacrifices being made around us before it is too late, to honor the quiet heroes who shape our lives, and to never let gratitude wait until the grave.